Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you, Bethany from Writers Online, for providing the platform and inviting me on. My name is Mikhail. I'm one of the founders of Publish Me. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join the room, and we'll be starting in probably 2 minutes' time. See, we've got quite a few attendees. Now, Bethany from Writers Online is going to monitor the chat, so anyone that has questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them into the chat, and then we'll do a live Q&A at the end, which she will moderate, in case I forget anything. And then we'll be nearly ready to get started. How long is the webinar? Probably about 45 to 50 minutes. And we'll do about 10 minutes Q&A at the end. Oh, wow, we have someone all the way from Nepal. I think today we have attendees from quite a few European countries. Switzerland, Germany, France, UK, Nepal. Yeah, that's Kathleen, that's including the Q&A session at the end. Philippines, Canada, welcome. All right, I think we'll get started. I'll quickly share my screen. Welcome, everyone. This is very exciting. I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Mikhail. I'm the founder of Publish Me. Publish Me is a Europe-based translation service provider and book marketing agency, with a small branch dealing with publishing. We specialize in working with self-published authors on foreign language publications. The way this talk came about is that we partnered with Writers Online on their self-publishing campaign for 2025-2026. And the idea behind it is to shed some light on best practices around translations, shed some light on trends in the European markets, and to look at how translations can become an essential growth strategy for indies. Now, I'll say up front that at the end, we do have the option to either contact us, or Writers Online will make available to resources. I've prepped a couple of PDFs. One's a resource sheet where you have service providers within the European markets, as well as a launch checklist that kind of takes you through best practices when it comes to novel translations. Right. Let's get started. I'm very excited about this. Most of the information that I'll share today, I've done my very, very best to base it off of data. A lot of it I've taken from FEP, which is a Federation of European Publishers. Some of it is through learned information through dealing with customers in various markets, and the rest is personal experience. So it might differ in certain elements from what you may have heard or what other sources state, and that's fine. I'm merely trying to demystify a process that I think is very, very interesting for a lot of authors at some point in their career, but it's not very easy to navigate because reliable information can be scarce depending on where you look. Now, what we want to cover in this session is how to turn your backlist into an asset that continues to earn money out of your home market through diversifying your income streams. The primary secondary markets that I'll talk about are Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. Mistake mitigation is a big one because there's certain mistakes that I see authors make time and time again. So I'll try and save you a lot of hassle and money. by taking you through them. And then, of course, effective marketing in the target markets, however and wherever possible. Because when we started Publish Me, one of the driving factors behind our model at the time was that we recognized the challenge in implementing and executing successful translations and then marketing them in competitive secondary markets where you might not speak the language or know the culture. Principally, this session is for indies that are well established, looking to expand beyond their native markets, or that are looking to diversify income streams, and anyone that is curious about the topic of translations but doesn't know where to get started. One of the things I like to talk about is that translations can be very expensive depending on how big a book you've written or how big a series you've written, but they are also an asset if done right. When I say done right, it depends on how you regulate expectations. One thing that we see often is that there's a reluctance to invest in quality translations because it's seen as just an expense. And at that point, what we're trying to teach or work on with our clients is to not see them as just something that is costing money, but as an asset that can continue to earn money around the world if you choose to. Because your books, if you're at a point where translations become a growth strategy in your author career, then your books have already passed the hardest test, and that is market validation through reader uptake, right? Now, how many of you have got more than 5 books published today, or let's say more than 10, maybe even? And how many of those books are currently earning outside of your native market? And I'll wager the percentage is rather small. We've had that. By the way, this PowerPoint, I've done my best to build it. I'm not a PowerPoint builder, so I usually do these talks directly. So it's new to me to use a PowerPoint, so forgive me if I skip a slide. This session is probably not for you if you're just starting out. If you've just started out writing books, learning the ropes of self-publishing and the indie business, even though it's interesting, I say translations are luxury good until they become an essential growth strategy. But I'll try and equip you with everything I can in order to get started correctly and right. And one thing I'll say to finish off on the point of the mindset shift is translating your books is not about chasing a quick win, but it is about future-proofing your author business through income diversification. And they are an investment that requires time, effort, and money and preparation to be put into it in order to be done well. And if you do that, they can pay off quite significantly in the long run. Now, translations matter today, in my opinion, because the English markets, I've stated here, they're saturated. They're not really, there's always room for more, but they're increasingly and highly competitive on every front, not just in terms of the amount of books that get released in the English markets every year. To stand out amongst that volume is tough at best, but advertising is far more expensive than most European countries, highly competitive, and you're really fighting the big fish, if I can say it that way, which in Germany, out of the Central European markets is the case as well. not to the extent as the North Americans, but in Spain, Italy, and France, advertising is very cheap. Visibility is much easier to come by, and it's much easier to scale than in North America. Europe is quietly becoming an indie powerhouse. We're seeing consistent growth in ebook uptake, even faster growth in audiobooks, a rising acceptance of indies within the publishing scene. Though I must say that acceptance, the further you go in Europe, the further back it seems to be. Germany, when it comes to acceptance and understanding of the indie landscape within publishing, is probably a couple of years behind the US. France is a couple of years behind Germany, and Spain and Italy are in the Stone Ages by comparison, which doesn't mean that there isn't a very, very attractive market share to be had for indies. I'm primarily talking about the perception of indie publishing in the mind of the consumer and amongst certain circles in publishing. What makes European markets very attractive is that competition in most of them is still much, much lower than the English-speaking world, and reader demand is rising very quickly, and that's a very, very rare combination. To look at the four markets that I want to speak about today, in a brief overview, Germany, or the German market, is the third largest ebook market in the world, behind China and the US. And it encompasses Germany, Austria, Switzerland, part of the Benelux states, and holds a potential 100 million readers. France as well gives you access not just to France, but to Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, and beyond. That's 80 million plus readers for you. Spanish will give you access to Spain, which, if I'm correct, is about 60 million people, plus one would say 500 million Spanish speakers around the world, but we'll get to that later because that's not quite correct. That has to do with digital integration and connectivity. And Italy, 60 million readers, rising digital demand. You've got to combine 290 million people at your doorstep, so to speak. Right. Now, the four European markets in overview, Germany is an absolute powerhouse and a huge priority. Spain is experiencing extreme growth in the last few years. Italy is the underdog, so to speak, and France the late bloomer. Now, what does that actually mean? Germany, as I've mentioned, is the third largest ebook market in the world. You have two major platforms that dominate. I think that my next slide covers that. Yep. Amazon holds between 50 and 55% of the market share, followed by Tolino. Tolino is an aggregator that services five of the largest online book platforms, and their backend is powered by Kobo, which is why Kobo as a platform is technically non-existent in Germany, even though their site holds thousands of titles. They don't actually play in the market because Tolino is their avenue. Germany is also responsible for almost 20% of Europe's entire audiobook revenue and saw over 50% growth in audiobook integration and uptake since 2019. That's massive. There are a lot of service providers within Germany that make market penetration a lot easier than surrounding countries, primarily in the graphic design and marketing spaces. But what you shouldn't underestimate is that readers demand extreme high linguistic quality and have a very low tolerance for non-native translations, as we tend to see from reader feedback time and time again. Genres that dominate are romance, thrillers, fantasy, and historical fiction. And even though ebooks, from a market split perspective, still only hold 6.1% of the market share, they account for a vast majority of indie revenue. And there's hardly any indies that go wide in Germany because Kindle Unlimited revenue through subscription models is just unbeatable in that market, which is also smart to consider because if you're entering a new market where you're not known, you're kind of starting all over, getting your brand and your name out there. Now, France, I said, is the late bloomer. One of the reasons that France is a late bloomer is that up until very recently, they were known to be a paper-heavy country. The French love print books, and whilst that hasn't really changed, there's a few things that happened in the last, I'll say, 48 months in France that really impacted how readers and users behave. Um, One of them was that the French implemented a law that stipulated you had to charge €3 delivery for any online order below 35 euros. And that prevented a lot of indies from offering free shipping to their readers if they wanted to purchase from them directly. Incidentally, it created a big backlash and drove consumers into the arms of digital. So digital reading and ebook consumption drastically started to grow. And along with that, at the same time, audiobooks started to play a bigger role in the market, which then saw the entire French ecosystem being opened up as late as November 2024, when we started to see big players such as Spotify, Audible, Saga Storyfy, and RB Media um, fight for market share in France. And that in turn is driving adoption from publishers, which is driving adoption from readers and consumers. The other thing that's happening in France, which is creating an opportunity for indies, is that a lot of publishers and magazines are being bought up. And this is what authors from France have told me. So this is semi-verified information. I did read up on it just yesterday. They're being brought up by a gentleman called Vincent Bolloré, who's a very right-leaning billionaire that is buying up all the main publishing houses and media, similar to Rupert Murdoch in the US. And that as well is driving consumers to look for alternative content from their established publishers, which spells a big opportunity for indies entering that market. The French have strong appetite for international content. They love reading international authors. They have an indie ecosystem that is rapidly expanding, but cultural quality expectations are exceptionally high, which means that a translation has to be reading itself completely native to a French speaker. They don't like for it to feel foreign, but they don't mind knowing that it is. On to Spain. Spain is a very interesting one. Spain is the only European book market, according to the Federation of European Publishers, that saw a 12-year consecutive growth streak in book revenue. The overall market has grown 23.2% from 2019 to 2024. And yes, it is a gateway to the Latin American and US Hispanic readers, but you do need to be mindful of the fact that when it comes to subscription revenue, such as Kindle Unlimited, Spain is the market. Kindle turnover in Mexico, from what I know, is comparatively very, very low. And a lot of the readers in Central and South America tend to like books dealing with how do I become famous, how do I become a millionaire, growth mindset, etc. And they're not as adjusted to consuming general fiction as the Spanish are. Simultaneously, audiobook adoption is surging in Spain, and not just audiobooks, but podcasts as well, with over 50% of readers in Spain regularly listening to audio as well. Popular genres are thrillers, romance, fantasy, and sci-fi. And that makes me realize I forgot to cover the popular genres in France, but they were noted down. One little secret tip for France, Scottish and Irish romances are currently performing or outperforming other romance genres with French readers. Now, what's really nice in Spain, and we'll get to the same point in Italy in a moment, is that advertising is still exceedingly cheap. I'll talk about a bit more about advertising later in the talk. Italy is a quiet underdog. Whilst reader growth or the book market growth has kind of stalled according to official statistics, a lot of numbers don't get reported, and we're talking over the last 2 years. And the more successful Italian authors that are established internationally are expecting that market to grow significantly in the next 3 years. Italy is also far less competitive than Germany, which is by far the most competitive market in Europe. And it's still way behind France. Excuse me. That being said, a large percentage of the indie market share in Italy is being catered to by international authors translating to Italian and then bringing advanced marketing strategies to Italy that help them gain an advantage over local authors. The reason for that is that in country, there is still a big lack of infrastructure and service providers that indies can fall back on in order to gain visibility, growth, and establish themselves. So things like newsletter service providers offering blogger campaigns, Amazon reviews, etc., etc. They're very scarce to hardly existent in Italy, which makes it harder for Italian authors. But international authors that are well established are finding a market that is great to play in, and it's a get in early market if you like, because competition is still significantly lower than in other countries. I don't know if this is probably better. Popular genres, no surprise, romance, crime, historical fiction, fantasy, and YA. Pro tip in Italy, sports romances are performing very, very well in the last 6 months from what we've seen. Now, a few years ago, a lot of these markets were a bit harder to enter because print still dominated everything. And while print still holds a vast majority of market share across the board, and we're not talking about indie publishing, but about publishing in general, I've got some figures on that later on, but I think about 89% of the European market in total is dominated by print still. Digital is rapidly growing, and we do see it as the future medium in a very short period of time. So for anyone not present in country in Europe, there's less of a barrier now, or the lowest barrier that we've ever seen, to enter those markets through digital audiobooks, both simultaneously, and local service providers like Books on Demand or Nova MD in most countries to handle print deliveries, if you so choose. A couple of interesting statistics to note. I've taken these from again, from the FEP. EU markets by turnover. Germany is by far the biggest, followed by the UK, if you still count that as part of Europe. France, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. I do see a lot of indies choosing Dutch as a secondary. Some of them do it through local publishers, some of them do it themselves. It is an interesting market to watch for, as is Poland. Those are markets by turnover. Correlating that to EU markets by new titles being released every year, the UK leads ahead of Germany, followed by Spain, Italy, France, and Poland. This is insofar interesting because France ranks third in terms of markets by turnover in Europe and only fifth by markets of new titles, which is also a growth opportunity there. And whilst Spain might only rank fourth in markets of turnover, you're seeing a lot of titles being released in Spain, which is indicative of a strong and healthy reader appetite. Quick facts. The surge of digital. Germany ebook sales increased 2.2% in 2024. Consumer market share remains stable at 6.1, which I've already mentioned. And this is relevant because, as I'm sure it was the case in North America during COVID in 2003, there was an absolute peak adoption and uptake of digital content consumption, even in the book market. And that's receded slightly as readers turn back towards print. But print is also growing with special editions, all the printed wraparounds and pretty designs, not necessarily standard print formats anymore. France is projected to grow at 5.25% all the way through to 2033, which is driven by digital integration in that market. Italy and Spain are both rapidly expanding. Spain is a notable one in digital readership and genre availability, while Italy shows increasing adoption of digital formats. Across the board, the European market is expected to reach almost 12 billion US dollars in 2030 with a steady annual growth of 3.69% starting last year. This just to sum up that Europe is a very healthy market ecosystem, you could say, for indies from around the world. Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of translations, and this is something that I personally am very passionate about because whilst we all understand the attractive elements of entering new markets, diversifying income, getting your backlist to start earning again and again afresh in every new market with new readers, new fans, there is what I call the quality trap in translations. And this is no one's fault except that there's little education or seems to be little education on how to actually implement translations properly on the net. These few points will save you a lot of money. The common mistakes that most authors make when starting out is using non-native translators, skipping proofreading, ignoring cover localization, ignoring the importance of metadata localized in a target language, and translating without a launch strategy. To give you a few examples, we've had a significant number of clients come to us last year that had commissioned translations, published in the target market, and got absolutely ripped to shreds by bad reviews. And then they're publishing in a market that might have less infrastructure in terms of service providers, especially for marketing, than they're used to. And so they start to doubt whether it's the content of the book, what they've done wrong. And you speak with them, and quickly you find out that it was a friend that did the translation. They gave it to two more friends that live in that country that might be Italian or French or Spanish to get them to read the book and ask their opinion. And they've said, of course, it's great because we love you, we want to support you. But technically, it's not publish ready or ready in any form because the translators weren't linguistic translators, the proofreaders weren't trained to look on what to look for. And friends are friends, they want to support you. When we recruit for a new proofreader or a new translator in any language pair, I'd say at minimum we burn through 20, 30, or 40 candidates before we find one person that is up to the standards. That's not to say that there's a ton of bad translators, that freelancers do the job, don't do the job, or any of that. No, absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying with this at all. It simply means that when you write a book, you invest heavily in the quality of that book. And that means getting a good editor, a line editor, getting a beta reader or a group of beta readers. It goes through several iterations around quality. And for some reason, when it comes to transferring the content into a new language, we see people neglect those quality assurance steps time and time again. We've got incredible proofreaders with years and years and years of experience under their belt from the UK that we will not use to proofread US-based English content, because there's elements to being a native speaker, to having grown up in a place, that you simply cannot replace. And as a result, one of our clients has a brilliant book currently published in Italy that's garnered over 1,000 reviews in a few short months and is still sitting at 3.5 stars average valuation because of the early feedback where readers really took that book apart. You can't skip proofreading either, because we are all human. It doesn't mean that a translator has done a bad job. It simply means that as a singular person, you cannot be expected to fulfill every aspect necessary to deliver a quality translation. Someone might be great at creative writing and they're perfect to do the job of translating your book, but they might not be a trained proofreader that knows the intricacies of language structure, um, common mistakes to watch for, etc., etc., etc. And even they will miss things. So beta reading, in the sense of having test readers read your book and then comment and point out mistakes that still slip through, you shouldn't do without. And then you go to a final quality assurance step where you review all those comments and rework them before you can be confident that a manuscript is market ready. After that, poor cover localization loses you sales, because not every market behaves the same. We do see that when it comes to covers, because Europeans are very used to consuming North American content. Ever since World War II, we consumed the books, the movies, the music. We're very used to it. So US covers tend to work fairly well in Germany and other European countries, depending on the genre, but not always. So it's important to do cover research within your genre, subgenre, similar books that have performed, other books that haven't performed, to see whether you can repurpose it or not. Driven by the consumer integration with TikTok and Instagram, the Bookstagram and BookTok bubbles, there are, I think, the lines or the time spread between cover trends that start in the US and them arriving in Europe, they're shortening rapidly. We're seeing that in France, for example. France was notorious for being very backwards with antiquated types of covers still being used fairly recently. But when we now look at the next generation of young authors in their mid-20s, mid to late 20s, rising through the ranks, that are very adept at social media, that gather a big following very, very quickly, and that implement trends that they see in another market very, very quickly on their home turf, we're also seeing that they're kind of jumping the evolution of cover designs in their own home market to almost match what's coming out of North America, primarily, because that transfer happens instantaneously through social media. Nevertheless, it is important to not go in blindly, because your cover sells your book. Then ignoring metadata, you can't just translate English keywords one-to-one into a target language without verifying if they work for SEO discoverability, Amazon discoverability, and indexing the right categories and everything associated with discoverability, including your blurbs, because they are the ones that help your books rank organically. There are great tools like Publisher Rocket that have expanded. I think last year they added a host of new countries to it. I don't think the year before France, Spain, and Italy were available, but now they're all available. They're not as integrated and as extensive as the English market or the German market is, but they are helpful tools. They're not the only ones either. But doing proper research or working with a local partner that can help with keyword strategies, blurbs, SEO in general is very, very helpful to your book success. And then lastly, launching without a strategy is like running blind, but I don't need to tell you that. We should also be honest with ourselves when it comes to the questions of when are translations maybe not for me yet? Because translations, you can say, amplify your foundation. They don't replace it. They're not a saving grace. They're not a lifeline. They're an expansion tool and a growth strategy at the right point in your author career. They're not for you yet if your current revenue can't absorb the cost without severe strain. This is an important point because technically your book's revenue should pay for its own expansion, if that makes sense. You shouldn't take out a loan, take up a credit, pay out of your own pocket, if you will, but you should have the revenue from your books, the revenue from your author business, be able to finance translations as the next step in your career. Translations may not be for you if failure to perform in a target market threatens your core business's stability. Again, I will stress this point because it's important. If you're investing X amount of pounds, dollars, euros, whatever your currency is, translations aren't cheap because they take a lot of work, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if the expenditure would threaten the stability, the core stability of your author business, should it go south, because there is always the chance that they don't perform in a target market, then maybe it's wise to wait a little longer before you consider translations. If you're still mastering the basics of indie publishing, needless to say, learn to walk before you learn to run. Once you've learned them in one market, replicating them in another is so much easier. But if you don't really have an infrastructure and framework that works for you, then maybe translations are still a luxury good and not a growth strategy. If you don't have the capacity or the partnership to take care of a new market, I can use a couple of examples of clients that we've worked with that have brilliant books. Bloggers love them, readers love them. There's nothing bad in the reviews. Translations were ace. They have everything they need, but those clients are so busy running very, very successful businesses in their home market that they're neglecting the secondaries. And therefore, they're missing out on potential revenue. They're quickly losing visibility. And essentially, you're risking having invested a large sum of money without a return, even though the return was possible. And so if you're too busy in your home market, that's fine. There are partners in a target market that will help you with those elements. They will even take care of a lot of it for you. And if that's your strategy to go, perfect. But without a strategy, or if you don't have the time capacity to develop a strategy, rather hold off for a little longer until you do. Now, the topic of the day. I'm excited and saddened to be talking about this. I don't know if you see me when I share my screen that way. But AI translations as a reality check, we do need to talk about it because it is a serious topic. You can see on this slide that I'm not a master at building PowerPoint presentations. Little ticks at on the left-hand side are not aligned. AI translation platforms or generative language models excel at a direct transfer of language. This means technical content, manuals, legal language, if you have someone that can verify it, and any form of documentation. They also excel at speed and volume. They are still severely lacking in emotion, character, and character voice, keeping the voice of an author, romance and subtext, humor and cultural nuances, and a host of other language components that infer emotions, infer reactions, that imply things, because a generative AI model is a uh, I'm sorry, probabilistic calculation of a sequence of words being put together. It is not human generated language, and it cannot replace it. Literary translations are probably one of the very, very, very few components within the realm of translations and linguistical arts that are exempt from AI capabilities as of today. And I'm not blind to the developments that are happening. I think in a year or two, they'll be unrecognizable from what they are today. I don't think that you can ever forego human control of the end result. But if you do choose to translate with AI, be very, very mindful of a few things. Um, just yesterday, I was sent an invitation by Amazon to beta test one of their new features, which is integrated book translations within the dashboard. So they're selling it as, well, you can publish your book in English, you can send it through our system, it'll translate it, you'll get it back in a couple of days, and then you can directly publish it on your on the next marketplace. And Amazon themselves are saying that only 5% of the titles published on their platform are being translated. So translations are still have a lot of room to grow. But you do need to be careful who you partner with if you choose AI translations, and you do need a partner because what Amazon are offering at the moment, even if it's a beta test, how do I know that the quality is good if no one is verifying it? And increasingly, Publish Me as a service provider is getting requests from authors that have either used AI translations and a service provider that said, hey, we're translating with AI. We'll do a human rework. You'll have a great result. And the results were subpar. And I mean subpar. DeepL as a translation software would have given us a better starting result than what we had to work with in order to kind of save where they were at and turn it into a half market ready product or market ready product. There are several reasons for that. Most AI generative language models have a limited generating capacity, because if they gave unlimited server capacity to every user, it would be it, they couldn't do it. Which means that if you have a book of say 100,000 words that needs to be translated, even with the pro version of ChatGPT, you're needing 4 iterations to do that. And if you're in fantasy, where you have a lot of fictional character names, fictional place names, entirely invented worlds, every time that AI will regenerate it, it'll invent new names. So consistency throughout is near impossible to achieve. AIs tend to dream. We see that quite a bit where they summarize multiple paragraphs into one big one, leave out key elements of text, but someone that hasn't written or natively translated the story does not know. And so all of a sudden you're missing context in between lines. And the biggest fallout that we're seeing from this is on the consumer end. Authors that have published books using AI translations haven't calculated what they're losing through bad reviews, lost ranking, lost visibility, and loss of reputation and recommendations versus what they thought they would save initially. So to put this into a little bit of context, and we can probably wrap it on that, um, when you publish a book, when you write a book and you publish a book in your home market, you invest in quality. I've said this just a few minutes ago. You invest in an editor, line editor, an editor, a proper cover designer, reviewers, beta readers, a whole host of people. It costs thousands of dollars to get a book ready to market. Why should you not invest in a transfer of language? The only thing that is different when you translate a book is that the story has already been validated by readers as being popular enough to consider translating it into another market. And if readers in your home market love the stories, there's a good chance that readers everywhere are going to love the stories because we're human. But when you compromise on quality, we've seen authors that had great rankings in their translated works that switched to AI with even AI proofreading, or only did one rework of it, and their rankings have dropped to 2.7, 3, 3.5, 3.4. And when you read reader reviews, it is shocking. And overnight, their books don't rank anymore, don't get visibility anymore, because as we all know, last year Amazon changed their algorithm. The A10 favors organic interest in your listings, and when there's bad reviews and nobody talks about it anymore, that organic interest is dropping, and that compromises your listings visibility. It tanks your revenue and your revenue potential. And especially in France, I hear it more and more from not only readers, but fellow authors in the domain that used to love reading certain American authors that stopped, and they stopped recommending them because they've switched to AI only translations and they think that they're going to get a good result for $100, and that's simply not the case. I'm not saying this because I want to drive people away from using AI as a tool, but it should only be used as that, as a tool. And anyone that is still considering AI-based translations with a human rework should remember the quality steps that we discussed before. If you do a translation, you have a base translation, you got to build on it with proofreading, beta reading, final quality review at the very least. And even so, with the base layer of AI translations, you're never going to get 100% result, but you'll get reasonably close if you do it smartly. But it cannot replace human translation as yet. Here it is. Native translation is crucial. So someone that has studied a language at university might be great for theses, but for literary translations, that's dangerous because they just don't know the local slang. They don't know the vernacular that you pick up naturally when you've grown up somewhere. I've lived in Australia for 13 years and I wouldn't dare translate a book from German to UK English or American English because I've never lived in those places for long enough to pick up the finer parts of the culture. Proofreading, absolutely essential, and you cannot expect the same person that did the translation to also do the proofreading. We're human, we make mistakes, and not everyone can do everything. Beta reading, super important. Get a few test readers together, or have your service provider check with your service provider if they offer that service to send a manuscript to a few test readers to point out the last few mistakes and passages that don't read quite so well, and then make your final quality adjustments before you go to market. Right. Once you've overcome those steps, you've decided that translations are the next frontier for you, they're an essential growth strategy for your business, then how do you go to market? It's important to note that it's difficult to test a new market with just one book. In Germany alone, there's between 70 and 90,000 books being published every year. I don't know what that figure is in the UK or in the US. It's much higher. But that's a lot of books. And as a standalone book, it's very, very difficult to stand out amongst all the others. But in saying that, every market opens up a new pool of readers to read your book. Every time you transfer your book into a new language, its earning potential starts fresh. Um, It says here, earn in new currencies if you want to hedge against the dropping US dollar. Okay. But you get to leverage new algorithms. So any visibility that the algorithms gave you at the beginning, or an algorithm gives you within the first couple of months of publishing new content, you can start that over with your backlist. And essentially your backlist is intellectual property that is sitting there as capital that has already been market validated, as we've said a few times, and can start to generate additional income streams in a new market. I want to cover a couple of strategies that we've seen that we see as best practice for indies considering translations. One is series are always easier to market in general than standalone books. And if you do standalones, don't lose the momentum. As we said, one book doesn't stand out in the crowd. So translating books 1 to 3 in a series and launching them within a month to 2 months of one another in your target market is a very, very good way of starting. And it's probably the most popular entry strategy that we've seen because it keeps up the momentum, it keeps you visible in the rankings, it keeps readers engaged, and the more readers are engaged and the longer readers are engaged, the more they talk about you. So it builds on read-through, trust, and algorithm traction. And it allows for rapid release. It opens up far more opportunities for marketing. We don't need to talk about the metrics here, but you can have book one still earning in Kindle Unlimited and being priced at 99 cents until the second one comes out, etc., etc. And then you offset the missed revenue, so to speak, of the first tome with volumes 2 and 3, which you can't do with standalone books. Market the second entry strategy would be a market test. So it's to translate 1 to 2 books, focus on your best performing standalones, and in this case, really focus on your marketing strategy and then test the market and see what the response are. And if there's promising indicators, then you can choose to translate more of your backlist. It's a lower financial risk, but it also means there's a higher risk of missed visibility. So it's not necessarily a strategy that I recommend, but I'm not here to make recommendations. I am here to inform of best practice as we've seen it, as we practice it, and as authors that we work with have implemented it. Now, the third strategy is probably the most successful one in the long term, but it is the one that we see being chosen the least because it requires the most amount of capital out of all three, and that's to translate 6 to 10 books into a new language and then do a longer term rapid release in that market. And that really builds visibility. And it allows you to cross-pollinate readers' interest with various books, various series. We do see a few authors do that, and the way they do that is instead of thinking of it as I have to spend the money to translate 10 books at once, they space it out, but they hold off on the first release and finance translations out of their ongoing revenue until they're ready. And in doing so, it gives them more time to prep release schedules, marketing strategies, work with local service providers, etc., etc. But again, it demands the most careful coordination and the highest upfront capital. Marketing is non-negotiable. I've touched on this before, and I want to touch on it again because it is a big question mark for a lot of indies seeking local providers in various European countries. Germany has got a fairly decent ecosystem when it comes to marketing service providers, but go to France and you're years behind. Go to Spain and Italy and it's hardly existent. So it's very, very difficult to navigate that landscape, especially when you don't speak the language. So For any of you that are interested in the launch checklist and the resource sheet that I've prepared that I mentioned, um, either you get it through Writers Online or feel free to email us at books@publishme.me. We're not going to try and sell you anything, but on that checklist, I do have listed certain service providers by country in Europe that you can use to promote your books. The big players, the good news is the biggest players are the ones that we all know. That's Meta, the Meta ecosystem, and Amazon as the primary global platforms. TikTok is exploding everywhere. TikTok does usually require you to be able to stand in front of a camera, but you can offset it with certain service providers that offer partnerships with local book bloggers. And then BookBub has some European reach, NetGalley as well, Goodreads, of course, and then there's other local providers. But in terms of platforms like written word media or a BookBub equivalent in country, there's hardly anyone. There's one platform in Germany that does newsletter marketing, and there's an offshoot of theirs in Spain that's even a bit smaller. There's nothing yet in France, and there's nothing in Italy. But as I said before, Facebook advertising or paid Meta ads are still much cheaper in those countries, and they actually work in tandem with the new Amazon algorithm that, in addition to organic interest in a listing, is favoring you if you drive external traffic to the Amazon platform, and Meta allows you to do that. Now, cost expectations. We're nearing the end. Um, Thank you for staying with me for this long. What does it cost to translate a book? I've tried to give you a broad range here. It depends on the service provider. It depends on whether you're using an agency and company in general, or if you're using freelancers and you want to do the fielding of the candidates yourself and deal with the various stakeholders involved yourself. So the costs can vary. I've tried to have them here in US dollars, in euros, and in pounds. Um, Literary translations are historically much lower priced than medical or legal translations. That being said, there is a certain cost structure below which you won't get quality, and you kind of have to balance in your evaluation the fact that with freelancers, if you don't speak the target language or you don't have a means of verifying the quality, you risk getting a poor result. I'm not saying that because someone is a freelancer, they're going to do bad work, but it simply means that your capacity to select the right candidate for the right genre and book might be limited. And with agencies and service providers, they have an entirely different cost structure. So costs are a bit higher, but you do know that usually your book is in good hands, and that you get quality at the end. I will say, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, but I will say that I have seen poor service providers in the AI space where authors have literally paid double and triple what they initially thought they were going to spend in order to save the poor result that they got back. So just be mindful, and that's what I meant with pick your service provider carefully. Um, so yes, translations are an investment. And then the next question that everyone asks and wants an answer to is, what are the general estimates on how long it will take until I make my money back? And I'll be very honest with you. If your books are performing exceptionally well, you might be lucky and earn out in 6 to 9 months, depending on the upfront costs that you've had. Right? That always plays a factor. But if you're looking at these costs that I've got here up on the slide, those are estimates. 12 to 18 months is pretty standard and is pretty good if you do the basics in marketing, if you do basics with visibility and you don't neglect your foreign language publications. 12 to 18 months is a good ballpark. 24 plus months means there's slower uptake. It's sluggish, but if your books continue to earn, as long as they continue to earn, even if it's not as much as you hoped for, it is an additional income stream and therefore still valuable. But there is the risk that in some instances your books will never earn out. And I'm not saying that's okay, but it happens. One author that we've worked with for a long time is saying that in her native market, she has books that just trudge along with very little sales. Um, and then she has others that are outperforming all the rest, and it's those ones that are her cash cow, but the rest are still earning in incremental stages, smaller amounts across a vast spectrum of published books. It adds up to a decent amount every month. And so you can't look at translations as a get rich or immediate result kind of project, but it has to be a long-term game and it has to be a strategic game. And then it can really pay off. Cheap translations, I'll say this and I'll leave the topic alone, but cheap translations simply delay your loss. And a bad launch and a bad quality can kill momentum before the algorithm can find your audience. Translations don't guarantee success. The same can be said for any book that you launch in your home market, but they can multiply whatever foundation already exists. So if you have a good infrastructure, if you have a strategy that you're working with, or you have partners that can provide strategy, infrastructure, and implementation, and you delegate it, then not being successful is fairly rare. But you have to measure your expectations and be realistic about it. Essentially, it means that as soon as you enter the domain of foreign languages, you got to think like a global publisher. You are an intellectual property holder. You sit on intellectual property that is proving in your native market. And if books are popular somewhere, they tend to be popular somewhere else. They just have to be sold the right way. And I think that's the game, no matter where you publish, no matter where you write. Diversification also offers stability. If something happens in one market that is tanking um, visibility, that is upping living costs for the consumer, and so disposable income is going down, as we're seeing in some markets around the world today, then having a diversified income from multiple markets can be very, very helpful towards future-proofing your author business, if you like. And with that, we're closing the circle and we're coming back to the start of this talk. Um, translations are a luxury good until they become an essential growth strategy. And I'll finish on that. I've said it a few times. Your books have already passed the hardest tests. Now it's simply time to let the rest of the world meet them. Thank you for your time. I will hand back to Bethany from Writers Online and the Warners Group, and we'll do about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A if there are that many questions. Thanks for listening. Thanks for paying attention. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Amazing. Thank you. That was so interesting. I think we can all say that we definitely learned a lot from that. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions in the chat, and then if anybody else has any other questions that they think of by now, at this point, just leave them in the chat and we'll get to them. I did make a note of the first one. So Amy, she asked that, well, she said that her worry about translations is that her books are already peppered with French, Spanish, Italian, Elvish. How would that work with translating my novel? She says her books are multicultural, young adult, romance, fantasy novels. Not all of the characters speak English. While not consistent, terms of affection and emotional dialogue will come out in another language.
That's a very good question. So from a service provider's perspective, especially when it comes to fantasy translations, we always work with glossaries. And I don't know if every service provider does that, but in order to keep consistency, glossaries are essential. Most of the time, authors don't give us a list of terms that are unique to their world. So it takes some time to establish them. Having said that, there are certain genres that are harder to translate than others. Cozy mystery would be one of those because of the humor inherent in it. and translating humor can be very difficult. So um, I understand that it might seem a barrier, but if the characters already speak in part in a target language, then it would mean that certain elements would have to either be rewritten, I imagine, so that the characters are then, I don't know if you can rewrite the story if you translate it to Spanish, for example, that the Spanish ones are Spanish, the English ones need to be um, clearly defined as being English speaking based on where the story plays, or you switch the roles and you change the perspective from which the story plays to Spanish, and then have the ones that spoke Spanish be English. I think things like that would be a discussion to be had with the service provider that you choose, and you should always feel comfortable and free to ask for a sample translation before doing anything else. So it's not always going to solve the question, and it doesn't mean that every service provider is going to be able to work with you on that, but concerns like that should always be addressed, and translators should always work with you on trying to mitigate that. I don't see it as a barrier to entry.
Brilliant. And Monica's asked, what is the policy on having an ISBN for a translated book?
So it depends on what you want to do with a translated book. If you're planning on just publishing it on Amazon, then Amazon will give you an ASIN, so an ASIN within the Amazon ecosystem. And for an ebook, you don't need an ISBN. Technically speaking, if you're distributing print books, then you need to register them with a national library as of the moment that you distribute outside of an intermediary's ecosystem. Um, but most of the time, using your own ISBNs is fine because you're the IP rights holder, right? So with Publish Me, we have a branch where we publish books in a target market on behalf of the author, or we co-finance certain projects, and in that case, we act as a publisher. The company behind Publish Me is registered in Estonia, and therefore we are beholden to the National Library of Estonia. So we are not obliged to register ISBN numbers with the National Library of Germany, even though sometimes they come to us and say, hey, we'd like to catalog this book for our archives. We'll work with them, but we fall under Estonian jurisdiction. So I imagine it's the same when you're in the UK or in anywhere else, you fall under your national jurisdiction for translated works.
Yeah, sure. I've had a couple of questions come in asking about replay or the recording. So yes, this video will be sent around to everybody who's registered. Hopefully tomorrow, depending on how busy my day gets. And we haven't got a replay booked in as of yet, but I guess if it's popular and you guys want it, then we will absolutely ask Michael to come back and do another talk
I'd
with
love to.
everyone.
Sure. I'd
uh,
love to.
let me see if we've got somebody else has asked, what are your thoughts on children's picture books? That's an interesting one.
It is an interesting one. I do have thoughts on them. I don't have a wide host of experience with them. We have done children's books translations, usually for authors that wanted to have a translated version to send to local publishers to see if they can publish them, because children's books are always print, they're not digital. And the same is for youth books. We're starting to work with one author in France on the marketing side of things for youth books. So I'll be curious to see how that goes. There is a big market, but I think with children's books, because, and this is just speculating, right? I'm just pulling things out of a hat here. But I think with children's books, because you need local distribution in stores as well or at fairs, your best bet is to try and go through local children's book publishers. And if they're really performing well in your native market, translating children's books is not as expensive as translating other books, because the amount of text inherent to them is very, fairly little. So for a few €100, you should be able to get a children's book translated as an investment to potentially being able to sell it to a publisher.
Perfect.
I don't know if this helps.
I'm sure it does. And there's actually a similar question from Malcolm. I'm not sure whether you might have answered what he's already after, but he said that you haven't mentioned anything about children's books,
Mhm.
how they feature in other markets. I don't know whether Malcolm, you want to, if there's any specific information that you want from us. If there is, just leave it in the chat, and we can come back to that one. What else have we got? Oh,
Does a good book cover matter on Amazon?
yeah, I just saw that
A
one.
good Your book cover is everything. It is the thing that sells your books. If you don't have a good cover, you're not going to sell your book. And that's because it's the first impression that meets a customer.
Mm.
And you can always tell when someone has tried their luck at Canva to make their first cover, it's not going to do it. You don't need the most flashy one, but good book covers are essential. And this is something we teach when it comes to marketing services, because either you're running ads, let's say meta ads, and you're seeing a very good metric around your cost per click, you're seeing good traffic, you're seeing good reactions to the ad, but you're not seeing any result in purchase. The first thing to do is to A/B test your back matter or your book description, and to see if another description will drive reader interest. The other thing to do is to look at your SEO and your keywords and how your book is described. But if all of those things are a tick, then you got to look at your cover. And if your cover is bad, we get this as a topic with authors all the time when we talk about translations and what covers to use in a target market. The cover is the most important thing about a book, second to the content.
Yeah, everyone says you don't judge a book by its cover, but Malcolm says he writes middle grade children's books. Do you have any recommendations for where maybe
Um,
language to translate into?
with questions like that, I prefer to offer a consultation and then maybe do some research. But I know of a few authors that we've worked with in France that used to write children's books, and they exclusively went through publishers. I think with children's books, your best bet as a secondary market is always the biggest one. Because if you're writing romantasy or fantasy, I'd say, hey, consider Spain, because you have cheap advertising, you have great reader uptake, you have consistent growth, etc., etc. When it comes to children's books, Germany is far bigger and more established with more infrastructure than the surrounding countries. So I think as a secondary, that would probably make most sense. But this is just a response as an opinion. It's not backed by factual evidence.
Okay. And Shanza said she's a bit confused what her book cover will say and what aspects should be fulfilled in a good book cover. Sorry, my words are not coming out.
Well, I think in short, there's a ton of good book cover designers that know what to look for, that know how to design a cover. I can't answer that without knowing what the book is about or the topic or anything like that. And without getting too much into it, there's a lot of service providers that can help you with that. Essentially, a book cover should tell you as the potential purchaser of that book immediately what the book is about. If it's romantasy, you know there's a dragon on it, there's a fae or an elf, you know what it's about. If it's crime, you have covers that portray that. If it's a factual book or Psychological thriller with suspense. Well, one thing that you can start doing is a little bit of market research yourself. Go on Amazon, look for psychological thrillers as a category, and then look at what type of covers come up, and you'll see immediate differences between Germany, France, Spain, etc. And then you orient yourself based on that.
Yeah. And are there any major differences within the UK or the US in terms of a good cover? And do you have any recommendations for covers, say, in France or Germany? I know that's probably quite difficult to answer without knowing again the genre and everything, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Um, Again, I'll just repeat what I just said in terms of do your research, do your due diligence, don't go in blindly, go in with a plan, go prepared. Um, I'm not going to say it's usually fine to use US based covers or UK based covers. It depends on the genre. In certain markets, those covers are perfectly fine, and you're seeing recent books being released with the same cover across the board because it's a good cover and it'll sell. Um, and with other authors that we've seen, they're testing covers. They'll have one cover that's an illustrated one, then they'll have one with. I think it's safe to say that what doesn't really work on a cover anymore in romance is the half-naked dude on it, right?
Yeah, nobody
Like,
wants that on their bookcase.
no, but there's still a segment with a lot of readers in a certain age group that will purchase that, but the general consensus is that you're better off with illustrated covers. But I think depending on who you're partnering with as your service provider for translations, they'll be able to also do some cover research for you or point you to someone that can.
Okay, brilliant. I think that is all of our questions answered. Sorry if I've missed any. If I have, please let me know right now and we can
Mm,
get to it.
no, um I think we can wrap it up here. Um like we said, I will make the PDFs. They're basic, but I hope they help. I'll make them available to Bethany, who will send them out. If you have any direct questions or if you want to have an individual consultation, I might just pop our email in the chat here again. We'll be happy to help.
Sent to just me. Thank
And if there is demand, I'll be happy to come back another time.
Yeah, we'd love
It's
to
been a
have
pleasure to be here.
and all the feedback in the chat has been amazing. Everyone's very grateful and have taken away a lot of information. I've learned a lot as well, so thank you. um,
Perfect. Thank
and
you
yeah,
very much.
like I say, we'll drop everybody an email hopefully tomorrow with the recording so you can watch this back. And if anybody has any questions or requests for any future webinars, yeah, just drop reply to my email tomorrow and we'll try and get them organized. So yeah, thanks a lot everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.